Today we're going to look at Ming and Qing China from 1450 to 1750. Ming China will really be the focus here because Qing China won't even come into play until 1640s, and it actually will go further into the next time period. But we're going to at least get it started with a brief overview discussion of early on politics and, of course, the dynastic switchover. 1368 to 1644, you have basically an overview of the Ming Dynasty. This is a time of lots of growth in the economy, growth of population, growth of technology, growth of commercialization. Cities are being developed because of all of those things, and they're becoming highly commercialized, which will lead to some issues with trading down the road, especially with foreigners. And then those new cities, when they become urbanized, showcase some of the cultural traditions that will carry over for China into the modern age that we kind of still know and look at today. Overall, there's a doubling of total trade for this dynasty. It was founded by a guy by the name of Hongwu, who is going to become a rebel leader born in very modest upbringings. He was actually an orphan, and due to Mongol rule, is displaced. He goes to a Buddhist monastery and actually learns how to read and write. And then when he becomes a rebel leader, he will help take control of one of the major cities known as Nanjing, and that's in 1356. When he does that, he's able to kind of use that rebel army to consolidate his own power, and he will start his own dynasty, which he will call the Ming Dynasty, because Ming is the old Chinese word for brilliant. He's trying to come out of the dark ages, so to speak, of Mongol rule and lead to a brighter time. He is going to also be very influential in starting a long line of bureaucratic policy where he, as emperor, is very directly involved in the government. Typically in former dynasties, there were large bureaucracies, which you've already studied now ad nauseum over time. This, however, is the period where certain things are done to criticize and ridicule and ostracize and eliminate powerful political people that are outside of his power in order to maintain a more direct control of his rule. And of course, law codes are rewritten. They hadn't been touched for quite some time, and the Mongols didn't really care about that. So obviously he has to also rewrite some of those law codes to consolidate and modernize, so to speak, what's going on in China. His first deal is to stabilize the outer perimeter, the frontier lands, with the Great Wall. He's going to use some of the old Qin dynasty walls and kind of combine them. He also will raise the level of height here because now we're talking about siege weaponry, which the Mongols were using at first to get into China, and so of course he has to try to prevent that. So he is going to raise the height of the wall and strengthen the wall and combine walls to make it more of a unified wall, very similar to the one that we know of today. And of course that will prevent the Mongol entrance as they turn more inward with their own issues over in other parts of Asia. He is very similar to other leaders that have taken over when a former dynasty is in charge. He wants to make his own mark when it comes to culture and society. The big issue with the Mongols being occupied is that they are changing the landscape of how the people dress and look and talk and act and all that kind of good stuff. So he, of course, has to change that as well. He wants to try to end foreign influence. Chinese traditions like government exams are brought back around. They're restored to the level that we will see new heights for, which we talk about in a few slides. He does not like others coming into the territory and kind of trying to push their way around, the Europeans mainly. Also, they're seen as kind of Europeans because in a way they're technologically behind at first, at least. And of course the Mongol names and dress are quickly dropped because he's trying to go back to cultural traditions that were already in place before the Chinese got there. The tributary system, which we talked about before, the kowtowing, that is actually strengthened and made even more formal and large, especially when we start adding different tributary states. And this is when you start having to talk about places like Korea and Vietnam and Japan and the Philippines and many others. They're all going to be used once again as tributary states now that he is kind of going back to the, once again, pre-Mongol tradition of using these territories for monetary or resource gain. This actual time period early on is really influential because of an explorer by the name of Zheng He. It's influential because he's going to kind of open up these avenues. They're not really new avenues per se. I mean, the Indian Ocean has been explored for quite some time now, but he does kind of help foster communication between China and some of the other regions in southern Asia and East Africa and places like that. Between 1405 and 1433, he'll take about 7 different trips using some of the largest ships in the world at the time, a picture of which is listed for you there, comparing his main ship to Columbus's ship. Lots of things are exchanged with communication, like exotic animals and goods, but it's not really good for anything else besides that. Economically speaking, there's only one really contribution here, and that is with jobs used for building ships, and of course timber for, you know, leveling trees and stuff to get the wood for that ship. 1433, these expeditions will be stopped because of the expense that they are using to take. Lots of people are on these ships, and the ships themselves are very big, and they take lots of money to maintain and all that kind of costly items. So he will, the emperor at the time in 1433, will end those voyages and have that fleet dismantled. Economically speaking, we're talking about agriculture once again as the primary source of wealth, and because commercialization is rising, you have the rise of social status of the merchants, which is not going to be good for Confucianism, that relationship, because once again Confucianism has always kind of looked down on the merchant class. Agriculturally speaking, though, that is the main source of wealth, even if the rise in trade is doubling. Rice yields are rising. We have to have taxation reform because once again there's more and more people being added to this equation, and peasants don't like being taxed. Also, regular labor service needs to be regulated because that's being required for making these giant building projects, some of which we will talk about in a few slides. The Great Wall, for example, is one of them we already mentioned, so that takes a lot of labor and skill to do. Commercial crops going beyond subsistence crops will start to increase, which is good for making money and making surplus, wealth happen for certain people. However, paper money is now going away. If you recall, the Mongols were kind of hoarding all of the silver and all of the actual precious metals and taking them with them into their empire, their ever large empire. Well, now we're kind of going away from that, and we no longer need the paper money because that money, that silver bullion is being reintroduced through whatever trade is going on. The politics of the Mings are carried over from Tang and Song policies. Once again, though, I did tell you about the strict control that these Ming emperors are starting to exact. It's the highest level of direct control that we've seen in any Chinese dynasty. So, for example, different positions of other strong political people are abolished, and kind of they get kind of pushed to the side. In the 1430s, there is a dismantling of the fleet by one of the emperors, and he banishes all foreign trade alongside with that. That's a really major issue because not only does it start the period of isolationism for China, but it also causes eventually the downfall because you have certain repercussions there. Once again, Europeans are not going to be just dissuaded because of a foreign ban on their trade. They're going to want to come over even with more force, and when they do, they start bringing more advanced naval technology and more ships, and the Chinese don't have as many resources to have to defend themselves, so eventually the Europeans exploit the Chinese and make unfair treaties of trade. That's a very big mistake and very costly for the Ming Dynasty. For as far as the cultural elite are concerned, when we start talking about culture, promotion of different forms of Buddhism are taking strength and carry over into different realms there of social bringing. You still have foot binding brought over by the Songs. You still have arranged marriages for women. There is a development of vernacular literature, which is really cool because you had been fractured with your language bases in China for quite some time. Now you're starting to have a common literature language being developed. Education is starting starting to be utilized. Different emperors like Hongwu do make encyclopedias that are important for education purposes, and of course popular theater in some of those floating worlds. It is taking shape in some of the urban complex cities when you have a different area where people can kind of let off steam and go see shows and plays and dances and all that kind of good stuff. Literature being developed for more of a personal reason, not just recording governmental records. And some of that pop culture is already mentioned in your book, so go back and look at that. Things like the Golden Lotus. Sometimes you will see an excerpt from that on a stimulus question or so, on a test or whatever. We have seen that before in AP, so make sure that you're at least understanding the example of what the Golden Lotus is or where it came from, so you can kind of use it to your advantage here. Women as another popular cultural identity or detail are being taught to read in more and more prevalent note. However, it's really one-sided. They want them to learn to read so that they can read Confucianism and maintain that in the household. So, you know, although education is being expanded to more opportunistic avenues, it still is purposefully being done to kind of aid other motives here. Technologically speaking, once again, China is kind of outsourcing and far ahead of their European counterparts for a little bit here. Mechanical looms and printing presses and different versions of the wheelbarrow, which make that more efficient, like the one seen in the picture below, the mast and sail wheelbarrow. They are expanding the Grand Canal and making different commercialized enterprises. I put on here that they're making paper-making factories and specialized workshops. All of those things showcase a rise of commercial interest by the Chinese because, once again, they're going isolationist, so they have to kind of build up their own internal commercialization practices and all that kind of good stuff. But other major building products and projects like infrastructure, like the Grand Canal, suspension bridges, we see a lot of increase in that during this dynasty. One of the great examples of a huge building project that is going to be now, in this modern age, a popular tourist destination is the Forbidden City, which is a diagram there in the picture above. This city was the capital and the palace structure of the emperors for quite some time, very closed off to the outside world. It took a long time even to get an eye glimpse of what was going on inside of it, for example, but it's still designed to impress you know, everybody within the country that could obviously understand what the purpose of this building was. Eventually, all things come to an end, so the Mings will decline. Smugglers on the coastline have been preying upon the weakness of the Ming Navy. They're not really building a navy. We can kind of consider them to be more of a land-based empire because of that. So when those emperors are not funding that, but funding their own lavish lifestyles, which they are, they're living in luxury. I mean, look at the city, for example. Then you have to worry about you know, peasants being upset and annoyed and other things happening with the economy and stuff like that. So some of those emperors towards the end are kind of retreating back to the palace and not actually dealing with government affairs. Wan Li, for example, towards the end, for records-wise, is refusing to meet with officials. Because there's no official meetings and stuff therefore going on, it's really easy for governmental affairs to kind of wane and go by the wayside. And that's what's happening here with the Ming Dynasty, and they're eventually going to decline because of that.
Good morning.
The actual collapse will take place over a series of famines that do happen, which is typically the case for the Chinese dynasty switchovers. Peasants therefore get organized and they revolt because they're not getting the same kind of equal service or treatment that the higher-ups are getting. This actual collapse is made possible by the Manchus, who are a group of nomads we'll talk about here in a second. They're invading from the north, and those Manchus ally themselves with this rebel base that are already within the territories, and especially in places like Beijing and other major cities. They will take over those major cities, and once some of your major urban complexes fall, there is probably not as much power and authority to kind of overthrow them. So that's pretty much the collapse of the Ming Dynasty. And so these Manchus provide us a little transition point here.
Good morning, teachers.
these Manchus, which are a group of pastoral nomads, kind of use themselves to combine into a unified state from different tribes. Very similar to what we saw with the Mongols. Nurhaci was the gentleman who did that for the first time. They create their own system of laws and military force, and once again, once they ally themselves with rebels within the territory, they slowly start to defeat any kind of opposition from internal Ming loyalists, and they consolidate their own power. Most of that switchover happens right around 1644. I say that they're kind of like the new Mongols here because in a way they're very similar to how they operate. They take control, very strong militarily speaking, get some kind of Chinese support in order to get a little start base going like the Mongols did with learning siege technology. They want to preserve their own ethnic differences, which was very similar to what we saw with the Mongols as well. Things that they do are very comparable to the Mongols, like the outlawing of intermarriage and the forbidding of Chinese citizens to learn their own language. Once again, if you remember from the Mongol discussion, we saw all those items and details already. So, the Qing Dynasty here, this is a map of the later part of the Qing Dynasty, but just so you can kind of see how far we're going to get with territory-wise, this is a very large period of growth for territory, and most, if not all, of modern-day China is eventually incorporated into this dynasty. Kangxi is the first major person of note here, 1661 to 1722. He lived for quite some time. Confucian scholar who will once again do certain things to make the peasant classes happy. It goes back to flood control like you did from your Han Dynasty DBQ. Some of those things need to be addressed as well here again with infrastructure, and he also will going to consolidate power by taking over places like Taiwan, Central Asia, and Mongolia. He then is followed up by Qianlong, and there are the dates for him. Once again, other areas are made vassal states one more time. This is the height of the empire here under this gentleman. It's the height because we know from records that at least 4 different times they were so rich that taxation overall was totally canceled, which is a major feat. Imagine if America today canceled, taxation and IRS stuff and deadlines for 4 years. That'd be very indicative of the wealth and prosperity that's going on within the territories. Rise of the Scholar-Bureaucrats is going to take off. This is a system that is very lucrative if you can pass the exam and become one of the very few that can do it. So here I've got some steps on how this happens. It's not really indicative of the poor because the poor don't really have as much time to study and take the exam seriously. There are 3 different levels, so you start weeding out the lower ranking people over the course of those levels of exams. Eventually, according to some estimates, there are usually about 1 million exam takers every year, and they compete for about 20,000 government jobs. So once again, this is a very prestigious thing, and if you can get your way through the exam system, you are going to be guaranteed some kind of cushy job there, which usually only happens for the well-educated and the literate men that are in the middle or upper classes. And then, of course, that's who's running your day-to-day operation of the government. Different things of society are still being utilized. The clan system never went away, filial piety never went away, and the patriarchal system with foot binding and female infanticide have never gone away. So some of those things are just being strengthened as a compare and contrast, or some kind of, even better yet, a continuity over time. Society things that are happening during this dynasty, for the most part, have stayed intact from previous dynasties that were hundreds of years prior. Food supplies start becoming an issue. That was what led to the overthrow of the Ming Dynasty. Once again, you've got an issue with population growth versus food supplies. Only a small portion of Chinese land is usable for farming. Today, that number is around 11% because the cities are highly urbanized and built up. There's not a lot of room there to farm, so it has to happen on the countryside. So therefore, commercialized farming is very slippery when it comes to that versus subsistence farming. However, the Columbian Exchange has increased other food supplies coming over through trade, so that does help the situation out a little bit here during the dynasty, and as we build forward, it's going to be a major issue. Got some facts and figures here for population. Around 1500, 100 million people or so estimated living in China. By 1750, you'll have around 225 million. So in 250 years, you're more than double the population. A couple things from that. Food production is going to have to try to keep up, and that's not easily done when you have that large of a growth, at least until we start having more and more fertilizer technologies. And then you've got large labor forces leading to cheap wages. When it comes to foreign trade, the exportation of certain luxury goods like silk, which was oftentimes monopolized by the Chinese, has now given way to other goods that are going to start being monopolized, mainly porcelain. However, tea and silk are still being highly exported to the Western powers and to other parts of Asia and even East Africa. However, the difference is that now, because of the foreign ban on trade goods, they're importing very little. Food is making its way over through diffusion and stuff like that, but as far as commercialized goods, that's going to become an issue for China moving forward. And we already know that their main thing that they are getting is silver bullion, because we did a whole DBQ on that. So the impact of the precious metal, you just don't know the impact of the lack of trade goods. Technologically speaking, China had always been, not always, but had for a long time been ahead of the Western world when it came to technological development. Well, because that influence from foreign powers to be is kind of waning here during the Ming Dynasty, moving into the Qing Dynasty, that technological development advantage has slowed down and gone the other way. And our main example for this is the use by the Europeans of gunpowder, and gunpowder that came from China was militarized and put into guns and cannons and stuff like that. And the Europeans show up on the shores of China with those weapons, and that's going to become a huge advantage for them. Christian missionaries also use different technological advantages to get in good with the emperors during some of the time period here, and they will also use that advantage to kind of spread the Christian message, which once again goes counter to the foreign influence that the emperors were trying to avoid. Gave you a little breakdown here of the social classes and how these things are staying the same or changing. So I gave you a listing of the privileged classes, which includes, once again, your scholar-bureaucrats and your gentry at the top, and how they're kind of separating themselves from the other classes, mainly their exemption from taxation and punishment, their fact they can own land and still live in the cities because they kind of get the best of both worlds there. I did give you a breakdown, once again, of the common classes there, which is highlighted by the rising of the merchant class. Once again, when you have trade being important and trade starts to pick up, eventually money buys a lot of things, and it's buying the merchant class here, rising of the social status, although that goes contrary, once again, to Confucian idealism. And then, of course, your lower classes here with your military and your indentured servants and mean people, as they're called, still at the bottom trying to fight their way up. Also mentioned, and I'll mention some of these again, there are examples of cultural influences and traditions and educational type of activities and examples that are listed in your gray book, so go back to that and look at them. Some of those things include the Yongli Encyclopedia and different collections of books that will serve as historical reference points for cultural tradition and how those things are changing or staying the same. It would not be out of this world that AP would give you a snippet of one of these documents in a stimulus-based question for a multiple-choice question, or they could use some of that for a possible DBQ if they were to do so. We have seen sometimes where those examples are relevant for you to keep an eye on. Last little impression here is on Christianity, as we're starting to get towards the horizon where the Europeans will come in and exact their power and authority over the Chinese. Christianity is one of the building blocks by which they are trying to do that. Highlighted here by a couple of examples. One is Matteo Ricci, who is a Christian missionary who will come over and try to get influence in the court of one of the emperors by the name of Wan Li by learning Chinese and using European science and technology to kind of shock and awe the the emperor as to what are the advantages of the West versus the East in certain regards, because once again that developmental gap is closing there between the East and West. Your Jesuits as a whole will use technologies like the clocks, for example, that they are famous for, to try to get in good with the peasant classes and the middle classes. They also try to do this by painting Christianity as being very similar to Confucianism. And so that's a very interesting argument to make, because once again, Christianity for the most part has been resisted by the Chinese because it's often seen as very exclusive, right? You can't believe in virtue of nature and all that kind of stuff if you're just believing in God, and other fundamentally different components between the two. So by the mid-1700s, there's around 200,000 Christians in the Chinese dynasty here, the Chinese world, which is not a large number when you consider how many millions of people were living in there. I want to say by 1750, once again, I told you there was 225 million. Well, 200,000 Christians, that's not a big influence there over the majority of that territory. You are going to have a kind of internal Christian struggle within these little groups that are making their way to China to try to get supremacy over what is going to be utilized as far as tradition and customs. For example, Jesuits keeping ancestor worship and conducting services in Chinese is often compromised by other groups of Christians like the Dominicans and Franciscans, and some of those groups are asking for an outlawing of ancestor worship. So eventually this internal struggle is becoming very, very messy in the court of the emperor, and Kangxi orders that there is to be an end of the preaching because he doesn't want his people on the common side being affected negatively by this internal power struggle between certain Christian groups. As far as effects go, and this is your final slide before we show you some visuals here, not a large effect on the Chinese population or cultural tradition. However, it does open up Europeans' eyes towards the Chinese, because once again, you're having that communication now more frequently than you did before this time period. And Confucianism actually, as an effect, is going to have more effect on the West than vice versa. And we say that because next time period, when we start getting into the Enlightenment thinkers from Europe, they are going to actually really gravitate towards several things that Confucianism highlights as well, mainly rational morality. So keep an eye on those things, and as we start talking about the Enlightenment thinkers next time period, we can kind of go back to this and see influences here, and then you can obviously make that connection between different time periods and different regions and different hemispheres. You should try to do that if you can. I want to show you a couple maps here so we can see the spreading of land and kind of territorial acquisition. They're the borders of modern-day China and Mongolia there in the little squigglies. So Shang Dynasty, time period 1, you're looking at that basic territory around the river valleys. And then the Zhaos, we kind of have to go through periods of organization, and there's a little bit of growth and consolidation and, spread. The Qin Dynasty, when we start having the advent of the Great Wall and other walls there around the other river valleys, and then we start spreading further and further south into the coastline even. And then the Han's, massive explosion of spread, and the walls are being strengthened and built upon, getting into Korea and places like that in the south. And then the Tang extending themselves along the Silk Road in certain areas, and the development of things like the Grand Canal. There's that illustrated for you as well. And then you're getting into the Song Dynasty here, which we know is going to be right around the time of the Mongols. So you see some kind of acquisition there and kind of, ballooning up of the territory, not so much sticking out over the Silk Road anymore. And then finally, we come to our last two that we just discussed today. The Ming Dynasty really starting to kind of push the borders and the boundary lands here of territory. And you can see what territory they're looking at. And of course, they have to strengthen that wall once again in order to keep some of these territories under control from the nomads to the north. And then when they're outdone, then we have the explosion by the Qing Dynasty, which will carry over into time period 5 and beyond. So if you look at that territory, you can see a very clear representation that encompasses a lot, if not all, of modern-day China and parts of Mongolia and even other territories as well. And that is all for these two dynasties. Make sure you're keeping an eye on comparisons and contrasts between some of these dynasties. And as you start to prepare this region for studying purposes for a midterm or for the final or for the AP, you really do have now a large amount of different dynasties that I think you should be able to do a basic graphic organizer for, to do spice notes and see how they're changing and or staying the same when it comes to those thematical issues.